FEMA workers are coordinating free gas delivery at 10 sites across New York and the Garden State.
It's one thing to think about restoration after a hurricane. Everybody knows the storm's coming, it's got a name, you've got 2 weeks to prepare. It's different if it's just something catastrophic on a bluebird day. You start thinking about being without energy, access to internet and funds and communications, and then water, something basic that you don't think about until you don't have it. It's really made me appreciate that we're vulnerable right now.
When a seriously bad thing happens, the only way we're going to be able to recover is if we put the pieces together in advance.
Resilience is really about how do we take that reliability to the next step and focus people, training, technology on unexpected events.
If we don't plan for a wide area black sky event, you're not going to survive it.
Kind of work in our silos. We've grown up in the industries and our particular roles that we've had. So we understand our box in the world. But now we need to really reach out.
There's so much to do in each of our industries. We sometimes get locked in on that and we don't lift our head up to look across the table and say, how can I help you and how can you help me? Using the same kind of lingo and same perspective that at the end of the day influences change.
Thank you very much. I think that sets the stage well for our next session, Delivering Capabilities in Time of Crisis. I want to thank April Wood, who has agreed to step in last minute because our initially planned moderator, Carmeet Rappaport, is in Haifa in Israel and needed to stay home because of the conflict. But I know we'll still have we're in April's very capable hands, so thank you once again, and I'll let you and the panel introduce yourselves, and look forward to more engagement from the audience as well. Thanks, April.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon to all of you. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I'm excited to be here this afternoon in London with many of the experts in this room and leaders across the globe. Delivering capabilities in times of crisis, talking a little bit about emergency management this afternoon. And as Chris said, my name is April Wood. I'm the president and CEO of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, our voluntary agencies and non-governmental organizations within the United States that provide disaster relief and recovery coordination during large-scale events. And so this is really where theory meets practice, I would say, for us. We've been talking a lot about models and theory and science and academics around some of these pieces, but practitioners in the field doing the work, how do we execute it? How do we apply all those principles in a realistic way? I know here in the US, just in the last month, the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency has released its resilience guidance. So there's a new collaboration document that's available on the US side to be able to talk about, again, some of those systems and how we put them into practice along the way. In the US, voluntary agencies are core to the backbone of being able to provide capabilities during times of crisis. Many different countries use many different methods, but our voluntary agencies work side by side our federal government and our state governments, our local governments, but in a way that is more collaborative. There's not a financial tie necessarily between those models. And so everyone is coming and giving of their own time and energy and expertise. And it's very interesting as you look at different countries and different models of what does emergency management look like. And in the United States right now, we're talking about what does the future of emergency management look like. There's a meeting next week to brief our FEMA administrator on the state side. So with that, I want to dive right into our panel discussion today. I'm going to ask our gentlemen here to introduce themselves as they talk a little bit about some of the successes and challenges that you're faced with when you're delivering your capabilities during times of crises in your countries. Alex?
My name is Alexander Harchenko. I'm a managing director of Energy Industry Research Center, and the name of company said what we are doing. For the last 20 years in Ukraine, we are one of leading think tank in project development. We collaborate a lot with National Transmission System Operator and some other structure inside Ukraine and with national laboratories in the US and. But I want to talk to you about our practical experience in very turbulent time. It's, of course, very turbulent time when your power system hit by 1,500 missiles and drones. And still today in Ukraine, everyone has power supply, and it's working properly, like exactly today. And of course, we will have some troubles in winter time, but it will be a separate discussion. Our resiliency is like an onion. And when we are talking about Ukrainian resiliency based on the layers. Layer one is nationwide, transmission system operator, who in wartime developed several very important knowledge and several important practice. First of all, it's a physical defense of our high voltage substation, which is absolutely critical to defend our objects in time of physical military attack. It works very well. And the system which is already built really defend all key elements of high voltage power grid in times of attack. Second very important thing which was achieved in this direction, it was algorithms how high voltage power grid has to act in time of attack. When we have information which part of country will be attacked and we have understanding which high voltage a substation and which generation capacity is in most dangerous zone, now it's working special algorithm which switch off this part of country, which directly make an order to go down for generation capacity and to move out from the supply switch yards to defend them in moment of attack. Because if something hit generation or hit high voltage substation when it's operational, your damage is times higher than if this object is out of supply in the moment. On next step, what we are doing right now, it's on national level, we starting to build decentralized generation capacity. Our energy system before the war was created by Soviet time. It's a huge generation capacity, 1 gigawatt plus in one place, in one site, and sometime one missile can move out from the system like 800 megawatts, 1 gigawatt. Now, conception is changed. All our rebuilding will be developed on base that one object up to 80 megawatts. It's a maximum from 5 megawatts. because in the same time we need small size generation capacity for some objects. It's like a national-wide layer. Then we have municipal layer. Municipal layer extremely important because Ukrainian cities, we have 24 cities, whereas we have 200,000 household and up. It's a multi-apartment building. Most of them have central heating. And this central heating based on gas, but it's not working without electricity. Because central heating in Ukraine working with hot water through pipes, and you need pumps to move that hot water through the system. If no electricity, it's not operational. Then each and other city in Ukraine right now develop own energy generation capacity to defend all key objects inside the city in case of regional or national blackouts. Because in situation when you have -10 by Celsius outside and your heating system is not operational, it's a real technological disaster. That's why each and every city invests in generation capacity very close to the objects, which is in charge for working of heating system, fresh water supply, and sewage. It means pumps, it means boilers, and everything related. Most of big city already started preparation of conception, which we named energy independence for city. That they already developed conception. It's Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, some other cities, whereas we have near 1 million or plus. They develop a conception how they can create a generation capacity which will make something like contour for city, energy district, which will be self-sufficient. And if something happened on national level, if high voltage power grid is not available, they will at minimum supply all their critical infrastructure and at minimum partly supply households. This is second level. On this second level, we also have a very important part. It's backup capacity to cover needs of internet providers and mobile telecom. Without mobile and without internet, it's extremely more negative situation than even you have no electricity at all, but you still have mobile phone which is operational and you have access to internet. It's really very important part. It's directly connected to communication, and I don't like to spend half of an hour of your time to explain why communication is so important, but believe me, this is extremely important part to take people in touch with world around. Even if it's dark, but they still have these screens, psychology work very well. You're still connected to the world. And last layer, it's a households. It's a buildings, private buildings. And now more or less all private buildings in Ukraine has or generator or battery storage. Small capacity, like 2, 3, 5 kilowatt capacity, but enough to be independent in time of blackout for 10, 12 hours. And now this small business which installs this capacity in households and apartments growing, I don't know, speed is absolutely fantastic. Like, I have information from some supplier of batteries and inverters for households in Europe that Ukraine now buy up to 80% of all volume in Europe, everything which was procured by European companies in China, in India, from everywhere, now moving to Ukraine. Because Ukraine go to be ready to the winter time, and each and every households do own preparation. That's how it looks. That's how many layers we have in this resiliency world. And in my last word from our previous panel, how to involve society to resilience issue. Ukraine is the best example. All society involved in energy resilience, 400%. No any doubts, everyone absolutely involved. That's where we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Oleg. And Ruslan, I know you often get to interact with the public. in your role in customer service. Tell us a little bit about some of your challenges and successes in doing so.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'll introduce myself. My name is Ruslan, and I'm a director for customer relations in DTEC. DTEC is the biggest private energy holding in Ukraine, and I represent DTEC DSO. It's a distribution system operator. We basically operate in 5 regions of Ukraine. We have 40% of the share in distribution in Ukraine, and we are serving 5.6 million customers. So our main goal and mission is to keep slide on and to keep customers informed. And today we talked about, and yesterday and today we talked about resilience. We talked about that resilience is the situational awareness, that you have to understand what's happening and then act accordingly. That's what we do, basically. And we do it in a everyday basis. So I agree with Alexander that Ukraine is I think the case study for resilience. Yeah, so the bad thing is, that we have, for example, 7.8 thousand damages of electricity infrastructure in Ukraine right now, and we keep fixing it. And the main thing what we learned is that we weren't ready for the customers to be informed. We need to develop the channels. And just one question to you all, because it's a lunch. I know most of them will be sleeping, but the question to you guys, if there will be no light, it will be like a power outage in your flat or house. What do you do? What are you going to do? Can someone tell? Phone, electricity company. What else?
Phone is not working.
Wait, Alexander. It's experiment. It's experiment.
I'll check whether the neighbors have power, and I'll look at the street and see if there's power.
That's a good point. That's a good point. But before checking the neighbors, you have to check the switch in your home first. But still, it's a good point. What else? Doesn't matter. Okay, at night you will be sleeping, so you don't care. But in the daytime? Okay, but candle is like a limited. I mean, you can do the candle 1 hour, but when it's lights off for 3 hours or 5 hours, what are you gonna do? Yeah. Good one. But still, we talk about electricity. Yeah, Elizabeth. Yeah, to save time, I will explain my logic and what we've done in Ukraine, for example. This gentleman said that there will be like a phone call. So we had 150,000 phone calls when the power outage. And my call center was down. The next step the customers do, they go to a site to check what's happening and when will electricity. 7 million customers come to the site, and the site was down. So the basic stuff, basic communication channels were down, and the customers didn't know what to do. So that was the point, that we need to think about, first of all, we need to educate customers what to do. And the audience showed that we don't know. So basically, nobody knows what to do. So the first thing is just to get the customers information about what you should do and where you find exact information, what's happening. Is the first thing. And the second thing, it's the hardest thing, is to provide this information, because sometimes you can't say when the electricity will be, and the customers getting frustrated and they call twice, 3 times. So basically, the main thing is just to make the customers know what's happening, when it will be fixed, and what to do next. So that was our main point. So we developed, for example, messaging system, chatbot, with push notifications. Like Alexander said, now all Ukraine, for example, right even now, I know when it's the rocket attack, and what part of the Kiev or my even flat without electricity, and when the electricity will be. So we do push notification to the customers to calm them down. So when it's attack, we push notification saying, this is the rocket attack, the light will be off. Then you should do the next notification saying, look, we assess the situation, the lights will be on like in 5 hours, please be calm and ready for the next steps. So this is how we inform, and all Ukraine right now on the messaging. So the main channel right now is the messaging and the push notifications on the situation, so the people know what's happening. So they won't, go in the call center. They won't go to the sites to just put them down. They know the situation at the first steps. So the customers know where to go for the information and what to do. And as you said, you go to, if you have a power outage, all the Ukrainians already know. First you go to check the switch, then you go to check your neighbors, and then you go to DSO's chatbot and check what's happening with the electricity. That's how it works in Ukraine.
Site and to check your schedule.
It's another thing. Maybe I'll tell it about later, but still, when we need to, to balance the electricity in the system, we have the controlled power outages. It's a reality. We had it in the summer, and for example, we have a generation in DTEC, and 90% of this generation, the thermal and the hydro, is damaged. We don't have it. I mean, we're just trying to fix it right now. So we had to come up with the schedules. So the customers have sometimes schedules when we have to balance the energy system.
Thank you, Russell. And that's a great example. We know sometimes it's very difficult to deliver your services during times of crisis, whether it's war and conflict, whether it's a pandemic, as we learned from communication tactics used during COVID-19, or whether it's natural and man-made disasters as well. So thanks for sharing that example with us. Andy, maybe you could talk a little about from the state's perspective, kind of how you guys look at delivering your capabilities.
Sure. So I'm Andy Nelson. I'm the director of an organization called the Construction Engineering Research Laboratory. So we're part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. If you're not familiar with the Army Corps of Engineers, we kind of have a twofold function and essentially serve as the nation's engineers. So in times of crisis, the Corps of Engineers is called on for public engineering services in support to FEMA under the emergency support functions. But we also support the military engineers, so engineering functions that a uniformed military, a soldier would be conducting in the field. So that might be provision of power, water, expedient emergency bridging, route clearance, all of these types of things on the military side. But on the civil side, it really corresponds to responding to natural and man-made disasters that may happen in the continental U.S. So my organization, we're part of an organization called the Engineer R&D Center. And so we are a research and development organization. So we're about 3,000 people strong, conduct R&D in support of those missions of the Corps of Engineers. And so April, you made a comment about sort of the academic perspective that we have. And I think one of the things that we do within our organization quite well is sit in the space between the academic approach to things. So whether that's modeling or new technology development, but then being called on to respond in the time of crisis to apply those new technologies, new approaches, new models. So just a couple of very recent examples of places where this has happened. Igor Linkov, who's part of our broader organization, spoke a bit yesterday about his work in modeling, his team's work in modeling during COVID-19. Another area where we were directly called in to support and respond there was in developing temporary care facilities. So designing and doing the rollout design and engineering of expedient hospitals that were put in convention centers and other kind of large spaces throughout the United States. That leverages the experience that we have in construction, mechanical engineering, electricity, power and water provision. Another example very recently was the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse that happened in Baltimore. So this is where, if you're not familiar with this, a bridge that was struck by a cargo ship, the Dali cargo ship, earlier this year, caused the main suspension of the bridge to collapse. That caused the complete closure of the Port of Baltimore, which is a very critical piece of national infrastructure for bringing commerce in and out. And when that happened, one of the first things that happened was a recognition of the complexity associated with this system that had collapsed. So there's an enormous amount of stored energy in the structure that is underwater, in many cases less than 8 inches of visibility, so very difficult operations, and operations where we would typically put a person in a dive suit and put them underwater to go and start cutting members. Very, very dangerous work to do. So again, we were called on to help support there through bringing in autonomous systems to do survey, underwater survey, doing both structural modeling to try to understand and determine where that stored energy was, how the structures and the members would react when parts were cut, and to be able to lift them out. But then also leveraging capabilities that we use for so computational fluid dynamic modeling coupled with a ship simulator, where we look at how we build new ports or think about expanding a port. We were able to put that into practice for determining how could we open the new channel to get shipping moving again. So actually bringing harbor pilots down to our site in Vicksburg, Mississippi, running in the ship tow simulator where they're simulating the operations of that ship under a very highly modeled environment to determine how to open up a new passage or a new way to do that. So the way that we do all this, and I think maybe the key point here is through something we have called the USACE Reachback Operations Center, or the UROC, which is essentially a cell that sits within our organization and understands the capability that we have, but they are the 1-800 number that people call, 1-800 number being the emergency number, you know, the number that people would call and say 1-800 ERDIC or 911 ERDIC, as we say, and we need help in this particular area. And so it becomes a clearinghouse where then we're able to bring people who are in their day-to-day work, working in a laboratory, working on modeling, but apply that expertise directly to a national problem or a global problem. And that's something that it helps enhance the relevance of the research that we do in the organization, because it keeps our researchers connected to practice. But it also helps to transition from things that are happening in a research environment into practice much more quickly, which is something that we often and always struggle with, is how do we get research into practice? And so that's something I think in a resilience perspective, we can also think about of how do we create that cadre of people who can help and support in that manner for the missions and the problems and challenges that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Andy. I know certainly we've talked a lot about systems and structures and the importance of those, relationships and trust, and being able to have effective communication between two organizations, whether it's government to the public or voluntary agencies with their counterparts as well. So also thinking about innovation and adaptation, of looking at any examples you guys may have of something where you were able to innovate and adapt to a moment to be able to deliver services in a way that you might not have been able to otherwise. I know partly in the US we've been looking for disaster assistance and being able to provide financial assistance through an app utilizing the blockchain. So a novel way to be able to push cash to disaster survivors, whether they have a bank account or not. So for the unbanked population, for example, the ability to do that very, very quickly, where voluntary agencies can put money into a system and have it pushed out through an app for quick financial assistance. So just thinking about any other innovative practices that you guys might want to share from your organizations that you've learned during crises that you might want to share with the group.
When we are talking of this systematic crisis which we have, I think the main interesting solution in Ukraine for business is microgrid. And now a lot of enterprises starting their own microgrid just to be independent from external supply. They build small generation capacity like gas pistons engines or small turbine. They use battery storage to balance their microgrid inside the perimeter. And they use sunroof and any space available for sun panel and to take PV as much as possible. And as a result, they really build some kind of independence of their microgrid, and they can operate even in case when national grid or regional grid moves them out of supply. And I think in 1-2 years, maybe 70–80% of Ukrainian middle-sized business will be absolutely covered by this microgrid issue. And it creates for us extreme opportunity because experience of how to build microgrid, it's not rocket science, but from other sides, it's not so many countries where it's really developed, where people has experience how to do this in the right way, and I could say for mass market. because in Ukraine now it's already mass market. Only we have maybe 10 projects where we help to some enterprises build this microgrid. And another part of solution, and you know, in Ukraine we have near 1.2 gigawatt of small size generator imported in time of war. But now all of them moving, because they are created to work for 1 year or maybe for 2 years. Then it's just a scrap. And now we have a wave to change all this old style oil generator to household and small business size battery storages. From 5 kilowatt hours to 30 kilowatt hours, battery storages in installation process like more or less everywhere. As a result, you have broad blackout. In general, no electricity supply, but all cafe on the street still working. In some window, you still have regular light, and it's moving in big scale. It's moving like everywhere, more and more. Of course, it creates some additional challenges for distribution network, and I think Ruslan can update about this direction if it is interesting. But for business, for small business, and for household itself, it's create very resilient situation. You really has no problem. Okay, I have no power supply from outside. My battery work for 10, 12 hours. I have no problem inside my household.
Thank you.
So if I can just jump on that quickly, you know, so one thing that I think we need to consider as well is unintended consequences on some of these things, right? So the Corps of Engineers response in the Maui wildfires. Wildfire started in the hills in Maui, ripped across towards Lahaina in a very quick fashion. This was an area of very high uptake of solar and home energy storage. So in the response and in the debris removal process that we had to conduct to clear those homes and areas to be able to return them back to the families, there was something we hadn't really encountered before at the scale that we encountered there, which was the prevalence of electric vehicles and the prevalence of power walls and the like in homes, and how to appropriately deal with those in something that had been partially damaged, but we didn't necessarily have the means to be able to determine what the level of damage was. Would it go into a runaway combustion when we had a crew, of people go in and take care of that? And so that kind of intersection of when we talk about in this concept of renewable and resilient society, what are those unintended consequences that we also need to think about that are going to cause us challenges, cause other difficulties, and in that case, put people in harm's way in a different way, in a new way. And so that was something that we're now kind of responding to that, but it's always difficult to consider what those consequences are in the advanced part.
Thanks, Andy. Let's open it up to you guys. Any questions from the audience? Yeah. One at the very top, Anna.
So when you were talking about your situation earlier, you talked about what do you do after 3 hours in the dark, 4 hours, 5 hours in the dark. One of the first things I thought about was, well, you need to throw away the food, right? That's in your refrigerator. So I was just curious, with all these blackouts and all the stuff's going on, what's that impact on your all's food supply and your ability to store and keep food and stuff fresh with all these blackouts and stuff?
Yeah, maybe I will answer. First of all, we still have papaya in our supermarket and fresh banana as well.
Bananas as well, yeah.
No problem at all. But from other side, we now working very hard with many, as I said, middle-sized enterprises to take care about this issue. Now they use oil generators, which is absolutely ineffective and very expensive to use. And all of them reconfigure their backup power to gas-fired generation and battery storages. It's a part of this macrogrid issue, which I mentioned in my previous statement. But it's really like a big-scale installation in Ukraine right now in many small businesses.
Hello. Thank you. Andy, question about your cell that you use to then go out and see how you can help. We have similar here in the UK. We have scientific and technical cells attached to various departments and policy groups and the Prime Minister and things like that. But they're very much blocked, I would say blocked, through the political route and chain of command and hierarchy. Is there an argument to say that embedding a cell with all of those different disciplines and expertise from a resilience perspective in, say, like our emergency response organizations could actually do the link between the researchers and practice on the ground, but also mean that we can learn quicker, learn faster, apply innovations and best practice findings on the ground far quicker and get that agile, iterative circle of learning and knowledge into the system far quicker, more effectively?
Yeah, so I think there's two key things. So one of them is resourcing, right? So in any of these cases, appropriate resourcing for the types of questions that come in so that our folks who need to work on them are resourced to work on them. But I think the other one, and part of the reason that it works in the construct of the Corps of Engineers and ERDIC itself is, as an organization, we are highly interdisciplinary. So we have pretty much anything that you would find in an academic institution, from social scientists and historians all the way to mechanical engineers and electrical engineers. So while that expertise is applied to many different organizations across the federal government, but it sort of sits and resides inside one. And so it gives us this ability where the UROC cell, the Reach Back Operations Center, has a connection to pretty much all the disciplines that they may need to work on a problem and knows kind of where to be able to go and grab those things. And I think that's probably a structural difficulty, and we've talked with the Royal Engineers quite a bit about how to gain access to the UROC capability for the warfighting function on the UK side, and we are essentially achieving that now through some left seat, right seating of folks, but I think it's the access piece, and then it's the uniqueness of the organization itself that kind of lends to that.
Thanks. April, as you know, and maybe others do as well, some years ago, FEMA and DHS stood up a new emergency support function, ESF 14, for cross-sector operations. The value proposition being so many infrastructure sectors now are tightly coupled and interdependent that you should be able to identify which specific functions, which facilities need to have power restoration first to prevent cascading cross-sector failures. That was the theory. In practice, I haven't seen much value added from the application of ESF 14. I wonder if there are opportunities to make it operate more effectively through AI, maybe automated decision support opportunities, so it's not just a bunch of guys sitting around and gals figuring out, well, we think this critical node needs power restoration first.
AI is a good thing, but when you have real blackout, you have to call to the station and say, guys, I need you to rise up generation in 1 hour. Just all style line phone. It's like it works in real life. We had real national blackout one time in November 22, that's all. After we was able to prevent even under attack, but it's how it was. No any real AI help in this situation. You need to have your natural IQ and use it immediately in control room of your system operator, and you have to know your system well enough to give right orders and to move it up.
I'll just adopt some, the thing is, like, we have identified some ways where we developed, for example. This one is the digitalization. Actually, we are boosting in this because this is the way we can serve the customers. We have like 5.5 million, so we have to interact with them. So basically, this drives up the digitalization of the service. So it's like in terms of the communication. And the second part is the renewable generation. So as we joke, like we have that we will, it's a boost our renewable generation in Ukraine because we have a thermal generation which is damaged. So we have a good opportunity to develop countries' renewable generation. And actually, it's quite resilient, more resilient than the traditional one because, for example, we have built the Telehul power stations. So, and it's more resilient than the thermal ones. So it's a good point as well.
And whether we like it or not, AI is definitely transforming many of our industries. And I do think there are probably applications within ESF 14 that it would be applicable to be able to utilize that. I know certainly on the grant side right now in the US, from financial assistance perspective, there is a group working on utilizing AI to be able to scan every grant opportunity and every federal programming opportunity available for disaster survivors to see if they can create an algorithm where you would automatically be able to apply based off of utilizing the artificial intelligence. So definitely a whole nother conversation and topic for the future. Lots more questions. We got 5 minutes left. Go ahead. Hang on a second, she's good.
Ukraine has shown particular capability in maintaining its railways, which must be extremely significant for the war effort as well as for evacuating people. I didn't know what your structures were. Are you relying on diesels, or have you been able to maintain electrification in rail? It's just a question that's sort of quite important in just understanding how you're managing that.
In the middle. A lot of attack focused substation of railways, and maybe 30% of them destroyed. That's why we use proactively diesel trains. We have to, we have no option. But same time now, railways started a special program to defend their substation and to build new grid, which will be times more safe. But it will take maybe 3-4 years to develop all the projects. But it's in progress, and electrification, very important part of railways business in general.
Thank you.
One of the points which came up earlier on was about unintended consequences of emergency response. But it seems to me from the responses given that it seems that unintended consequences can be positive in terms of beneficial. For example, with the rapid transition to renewable energy and these microgrids, post-war, and hopefully there will be a post-war, Ukraine could have some of the cheapest power in the world available at scale, which would really benefit the Ukrainian economy, which sounds like a very good outcome. I mean, it's disastrous having a war, but there could be a very positive outcome.
Yeah, I will start, and Ruslan maybe add something. But in my perception, what Ukraine moves through, we named between energy community of Ukraine, we named it stress decarbonization. Because more or less all coal-fired generation damaged very deeply, and even it can be fixed for 1 season or 2 seasons, it will die in perspective of 3-4 years. And we have no other option as to build new generation capacity, which for sure will be very decentralized, which will be maybe on first step flexible part of this capacity will be natural gas, but biogas ready and hydrogen ready. And many projects immediately have these options. And this flexible capacity open a huge window to build wind, solar, biomass, biogas. It just takes more time. Gas natural solution is the faster installation. That's why it will be first wave will be gas pistons and gas turbines, and then we will go to wind. We will, and I know that DTEC develop even now. They develop big projects, and we have some announcement about big solar projects as well, like 50, 70, 100 megawatts already. And I believe that at the end, like really, you're right. In 5-7 years after the war, and I believe Ukraine will have one of cleanest energy system in Europe. We will compete with France, and we will compete with Denmark. It's quite high level, and it's not so simple to compete, but we will do, I'm sure. And from another side, you're absolutely right. Ukraine is right side to produce electricity and to export electricity to Europe. We have a huge potential in wind. We have a huge potential in solar. We have huge potential in biomass that we can do all these things. And I believe it will happen.
Yeah, just add up, because we have this opportunity to build it from scratch. And actually, we have a project right now which is called Phoenix. Yeah, and it's about the development of the grid of the future. We have a 10-year plan to develop smart grid using all the best technologies we have right now to build it in Ukraine. So basically, the war kind of helped us to realize and to start the projects in terms of the net zero, in terms of the digitalized smart grids, storage, all the things that happening and people talk about it, we already started doing it. So I hope that after the war, we will have a much bigger phase in terms of the transition, in terms of the state-of-the-art grid in Ukraine.
Thank you for your patience. Final
Hi,
question.
thank you. First of all, I admire your courage and your optimism, and I just salute to it. My background is in gas, and I was working 2 years prior to the war. It was a pandemic. I could not travel to your country, but I've been working with your teams. What is a particularly fascinating aspect is when the attack started on February 22nd. For 3 days, Ukraine ran as a standalone island grid. And on the 27th of February, if I recall, it was synchronized fully with ENTSO-E. Yeah. Now, it is incredible. And there is just no way to understand what was the planning process behind it, how it all happened, what was the risk calculus that went behind it, but you pulled it off. I mean, that was admirable. Can you give us a little bit of flavor in terms of your risk scenarios, and how did this whole synchronization, I mean, first of all, desynchronization from Belarus and Russia, standalone?
I was a member of the team of Ukrenergo who did this by the hand. And you know that in the night war started, we disconnected from Russian and Belarusian energy system. It was planned before, like a long time before, and it was a part of plan of Ukrainian synchronization with European system. Plan was in that night in 1 AM, as I remember very well, because we took through disconnection. I came back, and in 4 AM, first rockets, missiles, explosion, and everything. And our target previously was like 3 days in island mode for Ukrainian energy system to take all experiments, to take all graphics, how it works, and then back to Russia. As war started, we absolutely understand that it's not possible. And we immediately start negotiation, like second day, we still have everything around, but we sit and we start connection to European energy system. And we spent 3 weeks to do this. And 16 March, we connected to European energy system. It was a lot of small technical peculiarities which was solved by both sides, from our side and from European side. It was a lot of political peculiarities because it was like an absolute mess. No one understands what's moving on, how to deliver some things. Like example, Hungary TSO say to us, guys, we need to postpone synchronization for 5 days. We asked why. They say, oh, we have maintenance and control room. We just have no access to equipment to do this. We call to Hungarian government, guys, please do something. 5 days for us right now, it's critical. Please help us. And all the stuff. It was how it was. And then we did it. And it was very funny when one of senior executive of ENTSO-E looked through our frequency in these 3 weeks. He called to the head of our TSO and said, man, when you synchronize, your frequency will be in not so good condition as now.
And just added up just one quote is that, you can't even realize how adaptive humanity is. And, I just remember the year before we had like lots of controlled outages and nothing working, like restaurants. Or right now, as Alexander said, everything's working even if there is no light. Generators, storages, everything's working, and we have still bananas in
Thank you, Russell. That's a great way to close us out. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of practice that we're getting. I know the U.S. right now is facing a major landfall of a hurricane in the next few days as well. So we continue to get practice in each of our countries. And thank you all for your contributions today. It's appreciated.
Thank you.
Can we? Photo? Oh, yeah.
Thanks. Once the selfie's done, I'll ask the session 11 on financial services panel to go ahead and come down.
Everything that we buy, everything that we use comes from a highly interconnected global supply chain that most people don't fully understand. The scale of a disruption, particularly if it's used with geopolitical tension, it could have catastrophic consequences. Resilience requires you to identify what it is you care most about, understand how it's delivered, understand how much disruption can be tolerated to that.
You need to use the same economic forces that are driving increased complexity, that are increasing the challenge, to solve the problem so that resilience can evolve in parallel with the hazards and the threats.
Good afternoon. Glad to be back. We're going to explore a different topic this afternoon now. We're going to look at finance. And there's three objectives really for this afternoon's discussion. First is to explore what the finance has done to move beyond risk management and into resilience. And I think from the conversations I've had, there is some interest from attendees in that, so we're going to explore that. Secondly, to explore what the finance sector has done for black sky events, if anything. I'm curious to know. And then thirdly, the corollary of that, which is what do other sectors need from finance, and what do we do to facilitate those discussions and move them forward. So to help me explore that, I'm joined by three experts from the finance sector. Perhaps you can just briefly introduce yourself first, and then we'll take it away. Russell.
Sure. Russell Jackson. I'm the Global Head of Enterprise Risk Management at HSBC. Previously at the Bank of England, working with Paul actually on a number of aspects of resilience in the financial sector. So.
Hi everybody, my name is Bethany Nutzel. I head up operational resilience and security at CME Group, which is a futures and options exchange and clearinghouse.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Butler. I'm the Chief Resiliency Officer at State Street globally.
Thank you. So even if I do say so myself, financial services is quite lucky, Mike. You're particularly lucky in that you benefit from some very forward-looking principles-based regulations which drive investment, not compliance, from a resilience point of view. I wonder, because you're UK focused, if you could give us your perspective on those regulations and the key characteristics of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really interesting journey that we've been on probably in the last decade or so in the UK, and it's a really good example of where, as a sector, we're all trying to get to the right outcome and do the right thing. And obviously, Russell and Paul were on the other side of me when I was at Barclays as well, and we were going on this journey together. But I think it really was a journey that we went on together to think about how we can raise the bar through regulations and through the behaviors and the engagement of the financial services institutions that really drive the economy of the UK, to address not just the sort of old way of thinking about business continuity, which is still very important, about thinking about the widget and how we can build protection for the widget to not fail and we can get the widget back up again as quickly as possible, but really start to think about much more broadly, what is that widget actually supporting in a life cycle of delivery and the ownership associated with it and the accountability associated with that, and making sure we are able to use some risk management principles as well as some resiliency principles that have existed for 100 years or so, to come up with a much more curated view of what the risks are that we need to be mitigating to ensure that we are resistant to failure, but also we can recover really, really well in the event of failure, and therefore protecting the integrity of the financial services sector and industry within the UK. I think that as regulators in the UK, that's helped enable that a lot more than in other geographies at the time. And we're seeing other geographies now following suit, which is great to start to say, well, okay, that kind of worked for the UK, right? We're seeing organizations really lift the bar, really get better transparency. How do we do the same thing in our jurisdictions and leverage that? And certainly from my perspective, we've actually adopted the UK approach and language terminology such as impact tolerance globally for our program as well. So while we have important business services that may be in the UK, which is really thinking about like critical operations, we have a lot more outside of the UK as well that we apply the same methodology. So it's been a really good journey and a really positive example of partnership.
Right.
With a bit of tension.
Healthy tension.
Healthy tension. It's always a good thing.
You talk about other geographies there, Bethany. You've got the US perspective on that, and whilst the regulations that Mike referred to were very UK-centric, the UK was the epicenter of a broader international movement on operational resilience. I'm interested, one, in your perspective on that coming from the US side of things, but also if you've any observations, because they're very principles-based, how well they might translate to other sectors.
So I'm going to try to do it in the spirit of the summit, right? So the principles that he was just talking about, I think the sector has adopted, and it's been, the Bank of England started it, and then it started to expand, exactly what you just said. I think when you think about those principles, we've also been able to take those cross-sectorally. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you is we created a tri-sector playbook. So the financial sector obviously relies on a number of different sectors, but primarily the electric sector and the comm sector. And so if you think about the principles he just explained, we created this tri-sector playbook in the States that allowed us to take those principles, but also coordinate it across all three sectors. So when something was occurring, we created a playbook. We've used it for several different situations, but we're kind of all speaking the same thing. The one thing that I will say is when you get to the cross sector, something as simple as terminology and meeting cadence was completely different across all three sectors. So we actually stopped creating the playbook and took a significant amount of time to kind of just talk through and understand how each sector organizes, how they prioritize, how they communicate with each other, and how they share information. And then we kind of came back together and created that playbook based on the principles that we were just talking about. And the playbook itself has been very valuable. We've used it during several instances, but the development of the playbook was more valuable. And so it's important that we continue that dialogue, and we're continuing to apply those principles across the board as we continue to move forward, because people are changing, processes are changing, positions are changing, to ensure that we can keep kind of, that baseline, applying that across the board.
Great, thank you. It's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? But the journey sometimes is more useful than the destination.
Yeah.
I recall the first, just to emphasize the importance of playbooks, but the journey to get there. I remember the first G7 finance exercise that we did. We thought we were being really clever, and we keyed it off universal standard time. And the exercise failed before it even started, because across G7 countries, we couldn't be clear what universal standard time actually was. So just being clear on those really basic principles and taking on that journey will help deliver that.
And all the acronyms we love as well.
Well, yes, indeed. Russell, HSBC operates a colossally diverse geographic footprint. I'm interested in the extent to which the term black sky is used within financial services, what it means to financial services, and how you might be preparing for it.
Well, I guess, so definitely it is used. And I think some of the thinking that's implicit in understanding black sky events and thinking about the nature of the different risks that they potentially bring to societies, cross societies globally, very important to a bank like ours in terms of thinking about the footprint and the interaction of finance across that footprint, both within the group and out into the wider financial sector, but also the inherent interconnectedness of the role that we play as a systemic provider of different financial products in different regions. And that plays back to understanding the kind of nature of those sorts of events, be that the things that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, extreme weather events, thinking about climate change at its most severe, and really looking at the ways in which we provide those critical economic functions. And it goes back to some of the points we've talked about on the principles implicit in some of that regulation. And I think where governments and regulators are looking at this is about understanding those critical economic functions, the way in which we provide that service, how that underpins the wider real economy in terms of the ongoing nature of the activity there in those adverse scenarios. And I think that scenario planning, the demand for that, the need for that as part of some of the regulation coming out is a real area of growth of forensic analysis that we can use to sort of differentiate where our challenges may lie and where we need to think about doing more exercising and engagement with clients and customers in the range of places where we operate. So a real need to sort of think about that interconnectedness across finance and the real economy.
Okay. In terms of preparation for a black sky event, I'm interested in what that actually looks like, and the conversation there around getting the standard organizational lexicon to acknowledge a black sky event needs you to move beyond probabilistic risk management. We've heard about looking in the rearview mirror for probabilistic risk management and actually getting the organization to embrace forward-looking, plausible scenarios instead. Mike, Bethany, what does that journey look like for your organizations? You go first.
Sure. It's challenging. So our leadership, extreme but plausible is the term that you were talking about, scenarios, that is the buzzword in our space. And it is difficult because of the low probability of those type of situations to get people to focus on those. So what we've been doing, and it's not perfect for a black sky event situation, but we're basically bringing it back to the principles and looking at the site, system, staff, suppliers, and how do you create redundancy around those. And when you think about the interconnectedness, what are the alternatives, right? And so we're kind of breaking each down. We're looking for single points of failure across the board, but does it get us to something that would cover a black sky event? I don't think so. So I think there are some opportunities there. But I think, for folks to buy into that black sky scenario, to kind of plan around it, invest in it, exercise it, there's still kind of a tug on that.
I think it's interesting when you think about, we always talk about the spread of plausibility or impact, right? So you've got severe but plausible, extreme but plausible, less severe but plausible. You've got this sort of like spread. And then within black sky, I think you have a spread as well. So on one end, you might have you might have ransomware, which is, in some cases, the impact would be extreme, but it's very, very plausible based on everything we've seen over the last 5 years in particular. You'll have extreme weather events. Well, we're living through a bunch of that even in the UK. We've seen it in Southeast Asia. We've seen a lot of that over the last, it's getting worse and worse. Wildfires in California, something that I had to deal with last week, and flooding in South Boston. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on just day in, day out. So that's the new normal, whereas previously that might have been on the more extreme end. Then on one other end, you've got like space weather and something that might knock out in the whole of the planet's communications for a period of time and stuff like that. And I think that side of it, we're probably not as well prepared for, but we're getting much, much better at thinking about, okay, what if we lost Bangalore and we lost Bangalore for 2 weeks because of some extreme weather or a geopolitical event? Or what if we had to recover the entire bank from a ransomware attack? How long would that take? What would the impact be? What data loss would we have? How do we do data rehydration with our clients and our third parties? So we're getting a lot better at that. But what it boils down to is the scenarios and the planning, and a lot more depth and a lot more destruction in those than we would have previously done. I would think in sort of BCM, back in BCM days, we may have said, what's the impact on the business process of the failure or lack of availability of this team of 5 people in this building, in wherever it may be. Now we're saying, what is the impact on the firm, on the market, on our customer base of the loss of that business process for X number of hours, days, weeks, etc. And then really identifying the scenarios that would cause that, thinking about ransomware or cyber more broadly, thinking about technology failure, thinking about extreme weather, thinking about third parties and loss of third parties and all of those scenarios in the third parties, which, by the way, is probably the thing that worries me most with sort of the higher frequency of some of those scenarios. But it comes down to having a really good view of what your scenarios are, really testing to destruction so that you can start to shake out what your risks are and what your actions are. And acknowledging that nobody has every black sky scenario covered, and the extreme, but becoming increasingly plausible is still a blind spot for most areas, I would say.
So it sounds like you're making great progress and having increasingly darker conversations, even if they're not entirely black yet. And yesterday we were encouraged to focus on hope and joy rather than doom and gloom. But anyway, Russell.
Sorry to interrupt, I do think that the outcome for some of the testing, certainly from my perspective, is that we've gone into a scenario test going, we have no idea how we're going to survive and be able to maintain our service in this scenario, and come out of it the other side going, do you know what? Actually, we do know how to do that now, and we've got a few things to be able to remediate, but we have more confidence now than we did going into that. And so there is positivity that comes out of that.
I would describe that as remarkable positivity, actually, because very often the corporate immune system reacts very violently to an exercise which may expose vulnerabilities or flaws that the organisation is not ready to accept. So being able to go into an exercise genuinely not knowing what the answer is going to be is remarkable progress. Yeah. Russell, engaging at the executive level, what needs to happen to kind of tip us over the edge from increasingly darker scenarios to a prolonged wide area power outage? If the unthinkable happened and there was a black sky event that lasted for at least several days, if not a couple of weeks. Mike, you mentioned the interdependencies. That just highlights that it's not just an insular problem, it's a wider problem. So what needs to happen to engage executives in that discussion, and then we can explore what the cross-sector looks like.
I mean, I think a lot of it is about playing back some of the shared experience that I think you've been talking about over the last couple of days of the kinds of events that have really sort of affected or undermined resilience in other sectors. And I think for us, linking that back to the understanding of our clients and customers and the way that they are impacted. And for me, one of the real benefits of where the regulation has taken us is much more around driving that need to understand the sort of knock-on impacts of a particular disruption we may have into our customer base. And the regulation talks about encouraging us to think about financial stability effects, the effects on customers. But inevitably, where you're considering those different scenarios, you do start to think about, well, in this sector, if we're not there for a customer, what does that mean in practice? And so some of that commercial angle of tying actually the nature of our operation and what it provides economically to the endpoint customer, and contextualizing that for executives with, actually, if you see those much more extreme events and you take that economic good that we are providing out of the equation, what does that do to those customers? What does that do to that sector? That's where I think you do start to get into the more tail end angle of things to approximate what people need to think about. And it is things like, actual, literal provision of cash in some circumstances, the scale of disruption across telecommunications networks, physical security in terms of weather events, the ability to make sure there is cash on hand for people to continue to exchange for economic outcomes in terms of goods is a very fundamental thing in terms of surviving those kinds of events and making sure that you don't see social breakdown around those more extreme situations. But there's also sort of broader economic goods in the corporate world where we provide very important hedging activity, which allows corporates to be able to kind of manage very severe volatility in raw materials or other benchmarks that may affect their day-to-day operations, where that hedging activity and our ability to sort of support the provision of those kinds of instruments, across I think all of our firms, it is a really fundamental sort of contingency for certain industries to be able to continue to operate even in those extreme events. So I think really understanding the ways that things play out for customers does take you to the, well, actually, if you do think about these events going to their logical conclusion, where would that leave our customers? How would we work around those challenges? What would be the impact on the societies that we serve? So I think that's the route to it, but it is about turning it into the commercial language, the language of the customer, the language of day-to-day society, to make that translation mechanism from sort of high finance down to everyday life in the street, Yeah.
Can I layer on top of that a little bit? So if I think about the regs, and then I think about kind of the evolution that you were talking about, we've also had to really identify what our essential functions are, our important business services or critical services, whatever term you want to use, right? And so because we're able to just focus on that box, I also think leadership can wrap their heads around a black sky event more than like, okay, you need to worry about the whole company. And so I think that drive within the regulation has allowed us to narrow the scope enough where they can conceptually kind of work through each piece. I think that will help too.
Great.
I'm going to add one more thing as well, because I think in the UK, where I think the regulations have really helped is that not only have we got all the carrots that we just talked about here in terms of bringing to life much more clearly the risks that executives need to pay more attention to, let's say, but there's also a stick that if you don't do it, then there's the regulators can take action against you as well. And so that sort of healthy tension that exists there, I think, is a real enabler to make sure that our sector continues to remain focused.
Great. I'm interested in that shifting dialogue from the technical dimension to the business dimension, because that is how you get the boardrooms to engage in the discussion. But if you follow that conversation, it gives us a nice segue into the symbiotic relationship that exists between finance and the other sectors. So it's very obvious, to me at least, that without energy and telecoms, the finance sector doesn't exist in any meaningful way. It's just not there. But actually, for the energy sector to work, the energy markets need to be working to allow the energy to be supplied. And there are other more technical credit facilities for drawing gas from pipelines, these things that aren't immediately obvious when you talk about cross-sector dependencies. The fact that you can get the boardrooms to engage in those business processes that impact the real economy is a massive step in the right direction. But how do we get to that next level conversation? How do we engage the central banks? How do we engage the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England to have a conversation around emergency liquidity assistance in the context of funding critical utilities? Because that's the holy grail of what we need to achieve here. But the path to get there, even having been at the Bank of England, is not obvious to me.
No, and I would say some of probably our shared heritage in that field, some of the most interesting discussions that we've had around resilience at the Bank of England, I think, were around particularly in the pandemic, where actually there was a lot of pressure across the sector in terms of credit facilities that were available to provide kind of working capital to absorb some of the potential shutdown of economies through the lockdown events and various other constraints that were created. And actually that working capital capability did come under a lot of pressure because banks were quite naturally looking at each other and saying, well, we don't know where this goes actually, and what size of holes are we willing to sort of open up in our balance sheet from lending that we may pay out that we may not get back because we actually don't know the future of certain businesses and types of business given the events that had occurred. And it did take central banks to recognize and realize that actually some of those financing facilities did need that backstop from the central bank balance sheet, from indemnity from government, to be able to step in to ensure that banks and other financial sector entities could feel confident that they could extend that credit, that could feel confident that they weren't going to put their own solvency at risk, and provide that sort of underlying capability within society. But that took us to very extreme late night phone calls between chancellors and governors to try and build those facilities and actually put that set of capabilities in place. I think what we're talking about here is ahead of time, what can you do to size and scale these sorts of things and really plan for that activity so that it's not at the 11th hour when things are about to collapse the next day that you're trying to run around to do this. Yeah. Okay.
I think they are coming to the table. So I know we're having a lot of conversations with the Fed. If they had an extended outage, what would we be doing? So I think the transition is occurring, right? There are critical partners that need to come to the table where we have these other discussions from a systemic perspective. So I think they're coming to the table and open to having the dialogue. I think, we just are easing into it, in my opinion.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I agree. And I think what's interesting again is, so I just come back to for me, your last comment just triggers something on me, which is that, so we were having conversations with Fed around extended disruption of our supply chain. And actually what we're talking about is sort of identifying what our supply chain is under stress and having that substitutability, which I know is a phrase we say a lot in the resilience phrase. And by the way, the fact that we're having this conversation at all, it sort of demonstrates the evolution that the sector has gone on from BCM to resilience, where it's talking about liquidity and financial stress in the same sort of, I guess, sentence as some of the more traditional physical threats. But that sort of identification of the real dependencies that you have to be able to deliver a service, going third party, fourth party, and joining it up, so you can actually work your way back and down to say, well, hang on a minute, to your point, right? Energy doesn't flow, or we can't burst, or burst is probably the key thing that we're looking at, unless the market is open to allow us to go and buy capacity in real time. So there's a dependency. What do they depend on? Well, they're dependent on what? And so that is a really gnarly kind of interesting data problem to sort of work back. But starting to pick at that is where we're all at in financial services, because the regulations say we have to, as well as the fact that it's just the right thing to do, going into our third parties, going into our fourth parties. And you think about some of the black sky events from 50 years ago, one of them probably wasn't failure of Amazon, right? And so there's some risks that are there now in our supply chain that just didn't exist before. And all of that needs to think about capitalization, all of that needs to think about workarounds, substitutability, so that we can get confidence that we can move forward.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'd like to bring the audience in now for some questions. And in particular, I'm interested in trying to build a relationship back to the Human Continuity Project panel that we had this morning, and we've talked about working groups. We've laboured that point a lot. One of the working groups will be on finance, and I'm hoping that some of these good folk will help contribute to that. But it would be a mistake to think that the finance working group needs to be full of just finance people, because actually what you've talked about is defining the services that you provide into the real economy with quite a sharp focus. That needs to be reciprocated with customers of the financial services being able to reciprocate just as sharply what you need from financial services in a black sky event. So in kind of drawing in your comments and questions, I'd be appreciative of you keeping all of that in mind. We can go to Colin.
Colin Taylor, Bristol University. Just putting my earthquake engineering hat on. The 1995 Kobe earthquake led to the collapse of Britain's oldest merchant bank, which was Barings Bank. The collapse in terms of a business, because what the earthquake did was shut down the Osaka Stock Exchange, which Nick Leeson was fraudulently trading on from Singapore, and because the stock exchange closed, he wasn't able to hide his losses, and Barings Bank collapsed financially as a consequence of that. So there's a connection there between finance and natural hazards, which then took me on to think about low frequency, high consequence events. By definition, they don't happen very often, and actually very few people actually experience them. And as a consequence, society can forget about what happens, and organizations and businesses can forget what happens. This is particularly true in big earthquakes, which might only happen every 25, 30, 40 years. In Taiwan, there was a major earthquake in 1999, which had a fault break of 11 meters horizontally and 5 meters vertically, which went through a dam, which survived, believe it or not. But it also damaged lots of schools and highways and so on. So it had a huge economic impact. But they get those earthquakes every 35, 40 years or so. And what the Taiwan government did was recognize that it was really valuable for people to keep that societal memory of that event and the impact it had on the nation. So they preserved damaged schools in their damaged state and other things. And every year, on the anniversary of the earthquake, they have huge public education events in schools, universities, and so on, for the people who experienced the event to tell their authentic stories to the younger people who haven't experienced the event but are likely to have experienced something similar later. And I think that lesson applies to businesses going through major crises, preserving those stories so that the people who are going to deal with the next event somewhere down the line are aware of it. And I think it also helps consciousness of within senior people to become more appreciative that actually there could be something worse and we need to think about it. So it's having that personal experience or trusting the stories, which I think is really important to deal with these rare events.
Thank you, Colin. In resilience language, I'd call that institutional memory. I'm curious if that resonates with you.
Well, I think everyone, less so perhaps on the operational resilience side, although we have our war stories, no doubt, but I think everybody in finance has got their great financial crisis war stories about where they were when various events occur, sadly. But I think certainly living through that period, and I was at the regulator at the time, I'm sure others were working in financial institutions, but what you saw in terms of the behaviors that created that fragility in the underlying financial positions of the organizations within the sector is very much burned into memory and consciousness. And I do find it's something, certainly with new graduates who are joining the company, taking them through the things to look for, some of the kind of risk behavior, some of those salutary lessons, if you like, of where that fragility built up and what caused that and where that could occur again from a kind of risk management, risk mitigation point of view, is definitely something that I think we probably all live and breathe to a greater or lesser extent.
I also, go ahead.
No,
One of the things that you talked about was incidents all the time, right? You had the wildfire, you started naming off. I think to layer on top of what you were saying, I actually think the fact that events happen all the time now brings those conversations as well, because it's not something in the past when it was business continuity a long time ago. It was kind of, oh, it'll never happen. They experience it one every 20 years. Now we're having events constantly, and so it's a mindset that leadership has adapted and has seen we are vulnerable. This could happen at any time. So I think those major events are part of that, but I also think the evolution of events that we're seeing all the time also feeds into that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say the same thing, because we're living in this perpetual crisis, it feels like, at the moment. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, and by the way, I studied geology here, which is great to hear the sort of earthquakey stuff. So just the Royal School of Mines, it's great. Lovely building around the corner. When you think about, there is a memory problem, right? Even though the institutional memory is there for some people that live through things. I mean, I know where I was 9/11. I was on the phone to someone who was on the other side of the river from Manhattan, right? So we've all lived through some really horrible things, and it's burnt in and etched in. But there is a corporate memory problem. And so part of and I'm going to sort of come back to the regulations, part of where the regulations help here is to remind us why we're doing some of the things we're doing as well, if we forget, right? And it doesn't, so everyone who's a professional in an organization, particularly if you're a resilience professional, you know what you're doing, you know why you're doing it. If people have lived through these horrible experiences, they know why they need to do it again. Other people may not. And that's where regulations come in as well, to help to remind us all that we still need to defend ourselves from these risks and be prepared for them as well.
Up the back there, in the middle, Chris.
Your knees are going to be painful after this, aren't they, up and down?
Hi, I'm Tom Dolan from UCL. So I've not heard a group of people speak about regulators so positively for some time. So what is it about your regulators that could be transferred into the economic infrastructure sectors and the way they go about regulation such that resilience and arguably net zero become part of the reason for operating?
I mean, look, I think that maybe resilience is a time and place thing as well, right? Where we all wanted to get to the right outcome for UK PLC. And yes, there was some encouragement to be able to do that, but I think ultimately we all just wanted to do the right thing and move forward. And that was probably a time and place thing. The consultation process that we went through in the UK to arrive at what's become the policy statements was a really healthy process. And it was, and I think probably what we saw during that from my side, from being in a bank, is that when we were suggesting things, it was listened to, incorporated, and played back. And similarly, I'm sure that the colleagues who were in the Bank of England at the time would say that when they suggested things back to the sector, that we actually sort of went, oh yeah, that's right, and sort of refined and came to that journey. I don't think all regulations are going to necessarily lend themselves to that level of open dialogue, but I do think it has set a really strong precedent for how the sector and regulators and central banks can work together to come to the right outcomes. That was certainly my view.
Declaring the interest of I used to work for the regulators probably should start with that. But
during the time when I was sat on
there you go. See, we got on very well. It was beautiful. For me, I think the thing that's very important about the nature of the challenges in the financial sector is the interdependency and the very immediate effects of the interdependency. So where I talked about the financial crisis and some of the way in which that contagion spread through the system, I think that did breed an understanding about the need to very clearly examine the interdependencies between financial institutions and the effects of seeing that cascade through the network effect that exists. And I think it's particularly the case when you flip that over into the operational interdependencies, where you see those real lodestones around clearinghouses and important pieces of the market infrastructure, the pipes that keep the money flowing, that keep the exposures flowing, knowing that those interdependencies around those really important lodestones of that interdependent structure, that's a really fundamental piece to grasping the resilience challenge. And I think the thing that the regulators, the central banks, have done is really create a focus on, from a sectoral basis, understanding those particular points of interdependency and encouraging the sector as a whole to converge around what are the ways to work together to try and exercise around that and understand the challenges. So I think there's something about the DNA of finance being around the very, very close interdependency of activities and the very volatile and immediate effects of our different institutions on each other, but then regulators playing that convening role, I think has been very valuable.
Sorry, just one thing on that was, we also had NatWest's Ulster Bank RBS incident as well, which was a big catalyst and probably reminded the sector that the dependency that we had on technology had the ability to significantly impact the sector. And when that happened, it wasn't like, oh, NatWest are down, poor NatWest. It was like, money cannot get around UK PLC, and our customers, your customers, everyone's customers are impacted by it. People can't get paid, people can't complete on their mortgages. This has real world, real life impact. And so everyone paid the price, if you like, from a pain perspective of an individual large bank having an issue, in the same way that today, if HSBC were down for, like, let's say HSBC went down for 3 days and we couldn't flow money around the economy, it would be a major impact to the economy. And that, we've had opportunities to continue to be reminded through some of these crisis events just how important it is for us to build that resistance and build those contingency plans and build that resilience, because if we don't, you know, the whole of the economy could collapse in a matter of days.
The even simpler answer to your question, Tom, is I think if you describe the regulations in plain English, it's impossible to look at them and say, but that's ridiculous. Why would you want to do that? It's just motherhood and apple pie. And good principles are deceptively simple, and the devil lies in the detail of their implementation, which drives a level of thought process. And because they were principles-based, not standards-based, we weren't getting in the way of organisations working out what the right answer was we allowed that freedom of innovation and thinking within firms to come up with the right answer, but provided some principles which were guiding that thinking in the right general direction.
I think we've seen that in the US as well. There's a strong partnership between the public side and the private side. So the regulators along with the practitioners are having discussions around these topics. And it doesn't mean that the regulators are going to write exactly what we want, but there's a lot of collaboration going around. If I think about AI and I think about other things that are cloud that are coming up, you know, there's a lot of dialogue, and you mentioned this around the comment period. There's a lot of dialogue going on around things that they're proposing or thinking about proposing, or even work products coming out of Treasury and such that we're intimately involved. So it's not like the two sides don't know what the other's thinking. We're kind of doing it together, although they are providing the regulation.
Great. Chris,
Yes.
there's a further back, two rows back
right
from
at the back
Tom,
of the stairs.
in the middle.
I have a quick question.
Your hand up again.
Until Chris will run, I want to know how much time you devote to educate the people you work with. I mean, at the end, we talk about financial resilience, but what about the resiliency of the people? To save money, to invest in a bad day. Do you have a lot of initiatives to promote that?
We do. I mean, we do a lot of education. I think actually Business Continuity Week is coming up here soon. I feel like it's in September at some point. But part of our response program, and we've been through, myself personally, I think Hurricane Harvey was mentioned several times yesterday. I'm from Houston, Texas, so hurricanes are second nature to me. But people can't. Did you really? Oh, very fun. Where's your accent?
I left at the airport.
Oh, nice. But people can't.
Sorry.
People can't respond if they're focused on their house. I mean, I remember during Hurricane Ike, when I was in Houston, I was working for a large energy company in their trading portion of their business. You know, I had to figure out how to move horses. And it was because if I didn't figure that out, I couldn't have them on the floor trading, to the point that you were making earlier. So part of it is like raising awareness. Houston, obviously, people are aware of, you know, they all have generators and things of that sort, but we're headquartered out of Chicago, right? So just looking at where our offices are, thinking about what their risk profile is in that particular office, and then educating them on ways that they can make themselves more resilient, so that when something does happen, you know, they can focus on responding.
I do think there's the education within our organization on how to be resilient and how to act in a crisis and all that sort of stuff. And I think you were also hinting at personal resilience as well.
Financial resilience.
And personal financial resistance.
Tomorrow there's going to be a flood and I will be left with nothing.
Yeah.
And I didn't think that will happen.
Yeah.
So now I come to you and I ask for money, and you're like, but listen, now you can't go to work, so you can't bring income, and now I can't give you a loan, and I have to pay the mortgage, and like things that people would think this will never happen to me. But unfortunately,
we do a lot of
you see
work.
it a lot lately.
I'm sure all of our organizations do a lot of work in communities as well to try and educate them, particularly small businesses. Not probably so much individuals, but like small businesses or sole traders, to help them think about being resilient to some of the threats that we're worrying about at a macro level. In you know, if they can't get their milk on a Monday, what does that mean to their ability to serve coffee for their customers, and are they going to lose money? Those types of things. But it's probably not something that is as high on the agenda as some of the other stuff we're talking about.
We've had the 1 minute warning, so really briefly, last question at the back, please. Thank you.
The industry's got a lot of experience thinking about information integrity, preventing runs on banks and the like. How has that changed, and how have you sort of evolved in your black sky thinking in terms of information, getting the message out that to have confidence in the stability of the system, particularly given that it may be a contested information environment intentionally as part of some of these black sky scenarios? And so how much has that been built into your, and what are you seeing from a shift in your operational resilience strategies?
I mean, I would say the communication approach, I think, is, to your point, is very much in the DNA because of the fear of and the practical potential of you know, depositors or other financial counterparties looking to move their money, and that being very existential to the fundamental cash flow solvency of our businesses. So I think the management of that, the immediate response to that is almost the first thing off the bat when we see any kind of incident. And I would say particularly the very striking thing within the industry, often when incidents occur, is the immediacy of, is this a cyber attack of some kind? And the need to be very clear and quick to dispel any rumor that it is a cyber attack, because the perceived potential for that to accelerate some of those financial market behaviors is very significant and very present as a concern. So managing the security aspect of any kind of incident, both if it is a security incident, obviously taking the actions that are required and providing that reassurance, but even where it isn't, making sure that it is not perceived as such is a really kind of interesting dimension, I think, of incident management that we particularly face in terms of that cascading effect. And people's basic fear in relation to particularly banks, but others as well, of, is my money safe? And that becomes a very overriding kind of impetus, I think, in our communication approach.
We do information share as a sector as well, quite well. So we information share within financial services quite a lot on threats and sort of anonymized information on vulnerabilities as well.
And we do messaging at the sector level as well for larger incidents.
Yeah.
So it'll be a coordinated message for customer confidence.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we'll take a 15-minute breather. So welcome everybody to coffee up. Come back for the final push. We've saved the best for last. Panels on education and community. We'll hear from our gold sponsor, and we'll give you an update on working groups, which I know everyone has been approaching us about joining. So see you soon.
You feel ready? Okay. So, welcome back, everyone. Please take a seat. We have final stretch of the day. I hope everyone's enjoyed your coffee break. We're going to begin this next session with a presentation from another PhD student. Xiaoming, here you go. And please.
Sorry, which one is next?
So this one.
Hi, everyone. My name is Xiaoming. I'm a PhD student supervised by Professor Washington over there. And today I'm going to give a presentation on my PhD research, which topic is scenario-based crowd modeling to facilitate crowd modeling. So here's a brief background on my research. On 31st December 2014, there's a crowd disaster that took place in Shanghai. That was merely to have a New Year event and has gathered over 300,000 people. However, there has been a tragedy took place at a staircase of a viewing platform, and that has resulted in 36 people died and 49 people severely injured. Just in the last decade, there has been over 100 similar incidents being recorded globally, and has posed a serious threat to large events and may consequently undermine the societal resilience. So what actually went wrong from a research perspective? Most crowd modeling approach would assume every people would behave the same way under the every condition. While this assumption works well in many scenarios, it fails to account for some extreme cases that's going to lead to the crowd disasters. So to enhance the resilience of our society against this kind of crowd disaster, which mainly including proactively prevent such tragedy from happening, our research aims to identify different patterns of crowd movement across various scenarios. So what are different scenarios out there? Firstly, we create a crowd disaster database. We collected 293 crowd disasters globally in the past 30 years, and we coded each disaster based on 6 characteristics. Well, the social scenario and physical environment are the settings of this kind of disaster. Information, physical space, and time are causing factors, and causality are the consequences. So to further do a pattern identification, we use a cluster analysis algorithm called K-mode, and we successfully identified there should be 9 types of crowd disasters. You can see the details about the 9 types down in the table. And we choose the type 9 to do further studies because it accounts for the highest frequency, which is 59 out of the 293. Here's a bit of explanation of type 9. When say jostle, it means the most participants are expected to compete with each other because they're having desirable items which is limited in quantity. So most, there's one example like Black Friday sales. And this mostly took place at the entrance of a building. So once we've identified the scenario, we need to do an experiment to further understand people's behavior. And because creating this kind of scenario might cause harm to the participants, we cannot do physical experiment. So instead, we do a better one, which is a VR experiment. So every participant can control an identical avatar through a headset and 2 controllers. And their aim is to pass through the gate as soon as possible, just to recreate the scenario.
And upon every successful passing of the gate, every participant will be teleported back to a random location and resume their journey again. Just to create more incentive for the participants, we're giving them 1 point each time they pass through the gate. And we'll also introduce a leaderboard which shows the top 3 scholars to give them a more competitive feelings. This experiment is done in the Verse Lab at Imperial, which can host over 30 people at the same time. So far, I know it's one of the largest VR lab in the world. So here's the result of our experiment. Again, we use class analysis, but this one's called dynamic time wrapping based hierarchical clustering. We're just gonna skip the boring math here for now and jump directly to the results. You can see from the graph, there's clearly 2 types of behavior. Within further investigation, we can see the type on the left, which we call them patient, because they're more willing to wait in the queues. But the green type on the right, we call them impatient, because they're more eager to seize any available gap and move, making progress as soon as possible. So the next step for our research is to understand the decision-making behind impatient people, because we identify them as the cause of danger in crowd disaster. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Isabel Johnson, who is the Executive Director of SNR Evermay, our gold sponsor. So we want to thank SNR for sponsoring this event and for supporting research for greater societal impact. One of those people is Dr. Srija Chakraborty, who Isabel is going to introduce, and I also have the honor of having Isabel as my brilliant and wonderful wife. So thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. As Chris said, my name's Isabel Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of SNR Evermay. We are a small private foundation based out of Washington, D.C. Our mission is to create transformational social impact for this generation and the next. And we do that through empowering individuals to innovate, collaborate, and come up with real-world solutions. One thread of that work is sponsoring dialogues like this, where we think sharing time and space inherently creates innovation. And the other is grants like our Kuno Award for social impact. So this goes to a woman innovator who is US-based. It's $100,000, and it is to lead a project. It has been from everything from maternal postpartum care to Dr. Chakraborty's project. So Dr. Chakraborty works at the university's Space and Research Institution. She also works at the NASA Black Marble Project. And what they are working to do is democratize satellite data so that it is immediately available to help disaster relief, to indicate where there are gaps in coverage, and also to create predictive models about where, say, a hurricane might land, the impacts it might have, and also where demand may increase through the passage of time and with population changes. So Chris is actually on our selection committee. If you have questions about the award, please follow up with him. And now a video from Dr. Chakraborty. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Srija Chakraborty. I'm a research scientist at USRA and also a part of NASA's Black Marble science team. I'm currently leading a global study on deriving space-based insight on the energy grid funded by NASA and Kuno's Applied Science Award, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to present our research and ongoing efforts. The electricity system is essential for critical infrastructure, industries, and human well-being. However, global environmental change adversely impacts it in many ways. With increased severity and intensity of disasters, there are frequent disconnections in electricity supply causing power outages, and there is a critical need for monitoring it in a spatially explicit manner at a frequent scale globally in order to support disaster recovery efforts. On the other hand, there is still a huge unmet demand in energy based on reports from the UN showing that there are still 675 million people without electricity access, and this demand will only grow given projected increase in population and extreme temperature, and there is a scope to meet this demand with clean alternative energy sources.